Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy. I am your host, Stephen. We are a member of the Parthenon Podcast Network, including Scott Rank's History Unplugged, James Early's Key Battles of American History, Richard Lim's This American President, and more. Go to parthenonpodcast.com to learn more. I'd like to quickly mention Patreon, of course, and your support really helps this whole operation keep going, and I just love it. If you just consider to donate on patreon.com/history of the papacy in the new year. There's 4 tiers: Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople, and Rome. You get inclusion on the History of the Papacy diptychs, bonus audio, video content, and much more. Just head over to patreon.com/history of the papacy to learn more. Now let us commemorate the Patreon patrons on the History of the Papacy diptychs. We have Roberto, Joran, William, Brian, Jeffrey, Christina, John, and Sarah at the Alexandria level. We have Dapo Paul, Justin, and Lana, all of whom are magnificent at Constantinople and reaching that ultimate power and prestige, that of the See of Rome. We have Peter the Great. Today is the last episode in our Summer of Scholars series. It lasted a bit more than just the summer, but it also started late in summer, so I'll take it that we got a little bit of a late ending too. But anyways, for today, we are interviewing a great scholar, Dr. David Wilhite of Baylor University's Truett Theological Seminary, to talk to us today about the church in North Africa during antiquity. We've talked a lot about the North African church in this series, so I highly suggest you go back and listen to our episodes with Dr. David Eastman, and even go way back to the episode that I did on the North African church, and you can kind of explore not only my changing understanding of North African Christianity, but also some older scholarship and how the whole church in North Africa was viewed. Because really up until the 700s, the history of Western Christianity was the church in North Africa. And it's just endlessly fascinating. And I think you really can't understand Western Latin Christianity without understanding the North African church more. Now, for this episode, Dr. Wilhite will lead us through a specific text and issue in the North African church between the Donatists and the Catholic party about a generation before Augustine. It is a fascinating time and place in church history. And with that, here is the next piece of the mosaic of the history of the popes of Rome and Christian church. I'd like to welcome our very special guest today, Dr. David Wilhite. Dr. Wilhite is a professor of theology at Truett Seminary at Baylor University in Waco. He's the author of numerous books, including Tertullian the African and Ancient African Christianity. The topic for today's episode is his book, The True Church, Retrieving North African Sermon on the Song of Songs. This is a short and readable book on a really incredible, interesting topic, and I think people should definitely pick it up. And I'm excited to talk about it because I think it gives the reader a really close look at all these things we've been kind of talking about with the African church, with the Donatists and the Catholics. It gives us a more of a personal view of the topic, I think. But so I think to start off, what were the theoretical frameworks you used to study these sermons?
Yeah, well, thanks, Stephen. It's an honor to be talking to you about all this. Let's see, the theoretical framework. So this really began as a journal article that I wrote, and I would say I was using pretty traditional methodologies just as far as, kind of trying to re-examine texts, trying to sort of create a chronological order and see what assumptions have been made in the past by previous scholars and what assumptions probably need to be challenged. And then I sort of tested them against archaeological remains and again, just sort of traditional historical sources. Now, the truth is, what was really driving that research was a theoretical framework that I had used in my doctorate, which was, in most general terms, post-colonialism. More specifically, I had adopted some of the sort of from the field of social anthropology, sort of how to get around some of the ethnocentric assumptions that we make. So again, and challenge those is, the assumptions of earlier historians. What were people's identities? What identity politics were at play? Things like that. Power dynamics with Roman colonization, all of that. So with post-colonial theory in particular, there's one author named Homi Bhabha who has a book called The Location of Culture, and he takes up this idea known as third space. And since that's already widespread in post-colonial theory of sort of to helping people who inhabit the so-called third space. They're not necessarily colonizer nor colonized, like that's too binary. They live in this sort of hybrid world. So what are their identities in that space? And then with this project, I was actually examining concrete spaces, basilica, buildings. And so that I sort of dove back into that realm of what is third space. There's a person named Edward Soja, I think is how you say it, Soja, who has taken on, this way of thinking from Michel Foucault and others, and saying, like, how do we understand actual inhabited places where people sit and interact, especially when there's sort of power dynamics and one view versus another view, and what emerges out of that is this third space. So I used all of that, trying to laser focus that on this one particular text.
So we look at this text, there's the dueling sermons, you might call them. Who were these two people who were writing these sermons about this space?
Yeah, so the sort of lost text to us is by Parmenion of Carthage. He's the bishop of Carthage after Donatus. And Donatus, your listeners probably remember from the Great Donatus Schism. He's the sort of the bishop that was at the head of all of that for 40 plus years. So when he finally dies, Parmenion is his successor. And he's also a long-term successor. Over 40 years, he's the bishop of Carthage. Even though he was exiled, he was the leader of his party. So he's hugely influential. And we know that he gives a sermon or some sort of speech when the Emperor Julian, whose history remembers as Julian the Apostate, because he was not going to continue the line of Christianity like Constantine and the other Christian emperors. Julian allows the so-called pagans to come back and have their temples and shrines back, and that means that all of the losing parties, the heretics of the early church, who had been ousted from their churches and their places, were allowed back. And so the Donatist party had lost control in terms of the imperial sanction after Constantine. But then when Emperor Julian allows the Donatists to reclaim their church buildings, their basilicas, Parmenion has this text that is celebrating that event. So that text, I say, is lost to us. Fortunately, even though, like most heretics, once you become a heretic, your books are burned. Most of the heretic sources are lost. But there's a response to it by a certain Optatus of Miletus. So he would belong to what they call themselves the Catholic Party. Augustine is going to come along in just a few years later and be the most famous voice of the Catholic Party, who also writes against Parmenion. But Optatus is sort of the person whose text, often his text is called on the Schism, or on the Schism of the Donatists. The title is a little unclear, but he writes this text that now survives, and he does his best to sort of, not necessarily line by line rebut Parmenion, but really point by point counter what Parmenion had claimed. And with it, and even more valuable, is at the end there's this dossier of text that he includes as an appendix that's supposed to be primary, pristine, untouched firsthand text, like court transcripts, letters from Constantine, things that both parties said. So we largely get sort of Parmenion's voice as filtered through Optatius's rebuttal. And then we also get many of the primary texts unfiltered, although there may be some witness tampering, but most historians are pretty happy with the text we have there. They're a great resource to give us insights into this debate between a particular Donatist bishop and a particular Catholic bishop who responded.
They use the biblical text, the Song of Songs, as the to build on, and the Song of Songs is a racy text from the Bible, and I think probably a lot of people maybe not would have even heard of it from their Sunday school, because I'm getting a feeling for a lot of Sunday schools it might skim over it. Like a sample from book 2, verses 4 and 5, the beloved about her lover, like an apple tree among the trees of the forest, so is my beloved among the young men. I delight to sit in his shade, and his fruit is sweet to my taste. Like, you can read in between the lines on that if you wanted to. There's some other ones that I wouldn't even feel entirely comfortable reading on a family-friendly podcast. What did the church think of this text? How did they reinterpret things that were very sexual, if you just by the layman's reading or the first blush reading of it? How did they reinterpret this document?
Yeah. There's no doubt, like from a historian's perspective, the sort of, it's poetry, right? So, Song of Songs, it's sort of derived from its original Hebrew and Greek names, but it's often translated Song of Solomon. On the surface, it looks like Solomon and his beloved. They're sort of sneaking off together, in love with one another. On the surface, historians are going to look at this as this originated as erotic love poetry. I mean, it is very explicit. You were tame in the parts you read, and even the parts that aren't explicit are clearly innuendo. And so the question is, what in the world is this doing in the Bible? So for the early church, and it seems evident that even before the early church, for the Jewish synagogue, this was clearly not something like role play for Christian mommies and daddies. I mean, it was not, you can go to, I've been to some pretty awkward Bible studies where they say this is like, advice for marriage or something. The two are not married in the Song of Solomon. So it's quickly, the word is allegorized, right? Allegory is where you take something and it means something else than what's on the surface. And allegory is a whole other ball of wax about how the early church interpreted scripture, but in sort of a simpler form. This is for early Christians, not literally Solomon and some illicit love affair. This is Christ, the heir to Solomon, Christ who embodies wisdom like Solomon, the son and king of David. And it symbolizes his bride, the church. So yes, it was actually sort of counterintuitive to our modern thinking, a very popular text for sermons. I mean, we have just mounds and mounds of sermons on this text. Bernard of Clairvaux is a little bit later than our period, but he has something like 86 sermons devoted to the Song of Solomon, and he only got to chapter 3, verse 1. He has 8 sermons just on the second verse, where it says he kisses me with the kisses of his mouth. I think it's sweeter than wine, I think it says. So 8 sermons just on the kisses. But if this is Jesus, and Jesus is the lover of my soul, you see, then it becomes much more more passionate, much more interesting for early Christians.
Now, taking those two bits, and kind of the last piece that falls in is Julian Apostate, as you mentioned. He gives that basilica back, or he gives it to the Donatists. And do we know what Julian's motivation was? Was he sort of, in the modern parlance, trolling the Catholic party, or did he feel legitimately that was the better claim of the two groups?
Yeah. So here's my take on Julian and allowing sort of Julian does sort of allow and promote. So I think there's a case by case basis is sort of the way I take Julian. The sources are that he actually allowed the Jews to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. And this was definitely, and I think he funded it, if I remember correctly from the sources. So this is definitely him sort of poking Christians in the eye and saying, see, your Jesus's claims to destroy the temple is not true. We're going to rebuild it. Now that never happened, and lots of debate as to why, but he, one, he died, but two, there was supposedly an earthquake and defunding and all of this. So in cases like that, in cases where he allowed the pagans to come back and take back temples, he's certainly trying to reassert old Rome and old Rome pagan values. Now with Christians, I think partly once the sort of imperial influence is removed from church affairs, it's just much easier for Christians to sort of run their own ship. So from the time of Donatus, it's pretty clear that Donatus, Donatus is the sort of the founding bishop of the Donatist schism, and Parmenion is his successor, who we're talking about. But even though Donatus does not win control of the church in Carthage because Constantine intervened, It seems clear that the majority of the Carthaginian Christians and the majority of the North African Christians at large are supporting the Donatist party. And so the only reason that the so-called Catholic party can claim to be the Catholic party is because they have the backing of the emperor. Once the emperor is backed away, I mean, then it seems, I mean, probably too crude, but it's something like mob rule back in the Carthaginian church.
You talk about the post-colonialist view of the North African church. And I've read things that the Donatist party, some scholars would say that they were the native Berbers, or that they were in opposition to the Romans and the Greeks. Is there any truth to that? Is there any evidence that would back that up?
Well, so that's sort of too simplistic of a view. A scholar named W.H.C. Friend in the middle of the last century really promoted that idea on the basis of some of the later evidence that you sort of can match where are these Donatist bishops from, and they tend to be more rural. So that's kind of been shown to be some flawed methodology, right? Once you're kicked out of your churches, well, of course, you're stuck in the rural churches. Once the imperial influence in all the urban centers is there. So I don't know that you would say that Augustine's Catholic party was not African. I think to take a step back from this, the first issue is we read all of these sources and they're in Latin. And so we think of all of these writers all the way back to the earliest North African sources like Tertullian, Cyprian. We think of them as Latin, Roman, Western Christians. And to an extent they are. But I sort of liken this to the Apostle Paul, right? Paul is actually Saul. He calls himself a Hebrew of Hebrews. And yet he has a Greek name, Paulus, and a Latin name. And he sees himself as the apostle to the Gentiles. He's a Roman citizen. And yet, if you ever try to think of Paul as a Greek or a Roman citizen and not understand his Hebrew identity, right, a Hebrew of Hebrews, you would completely miss Paul. Well, we have the exact same dynamic in North Africa. We have all these Latin writers with Latinized names, but that doesn't take away from the fact that they're also North African. And this has been largely ignored by the last century of scholarship. And this is sort of one of my soapboxes. I've written a book trying to kind of tackle this, to say this is, if you just scratch beneath the surface. So Roman historians once thought of North Africa as the most Romanized of all the provinces. After the Punic Wars, poor Hannibal and all his friends lost, and Rome just took over and completely revolutionized North Africa. Well, Roman historians for over a century have known that that's a misunderstanding, that North Africa is Romanized in the sense that legions are established there, Roman buildings are erected there, Roman government is imposed there. And yet the sort of, you remember the Punic Wars, Hannibal, the Punic language, the Punic religion, Punic culture continued throughout the Roman period. So then you have another layer. There's the so-called Berber, or the indigenous, what the Greeks would have called the Libyans. The Punic are themselves this sort of coastal influence that spread their empire, and yet inland we have some other, probably not even one single, probably this multi group of tribes and cultures and societies. So all of this just becomes a melting pot that is only known through Latin sources, literary sources. Now, again, the Punic, the Berber inscriptions survive to tell us that these other things are happening. Yeah, when you read about North African Christians, you can find Augustine saying, "Hey, I am an African of Africans," and I'm writing. He'll mention other African writers like a non-Christian named Apuleius, who is a speaker and rhetorician. He says, "I refer to him because Africans know him better." So this African identity is still around, even for people in the Catholic Party. But what I think is happening is the Catholic Party is intentionally siding with the Italian part, the Catholic Party of North Africa, is intentionally siding with the North African and Constantinopolitan sort of power centers. And yet you have folks in North Africa who claim, no, we're siding with our tradition going back to Cyprian, to Tertullian. They claim them explicitly. So that's where I do think there is an identity issue, but it's not a simple ethnic breakdown, if that makes sense.
And now a word from our sponsors. I mean, would it be more comparable to something where the Africans are grabbing onto a local identity, where the Catholic Party is trying to make themselves more cosmopolitan?
Local. So again, this is where identity are so complex, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I live in Texas, and in a way I'm a Texan, but in another way I'm an American, in another way I'm a Christian, and another way I'm whatever political party you want to claim, right? So there's no doubt that on the surface, in these Christian texts, what they're claiming is to be the true Christian identity. But what the Donatists are also explicitly claiming is they're holding to the tradition of Saint Cyprian, who came before them. And Saint Cyprian had this major falling out, as you know, with Saint Stephen, the Bishop of Rome. And Cyprian has a council of bishops from North Africa. Stephen has a council of bishops from Italy. And there's this Italian and African tradition that diverges. Well, the Donatists are squarely within the Cyprianic African tradition. And Augustine knows it. Augustine knows that he's sided with this Catholic. But what he wants to say is, but I'm siding with the universal church, not just the Italian, certainly not just the African, everywhere. And then he has a lot of texts where he says, and by the way, Cyprian did say this, but he meant that, or Cyprian would have said this today if he'd had a more opportunity to dialogue with the wider Catholic world. So yes, there's an explicit attempt to claim their African tradition, but they see it as the right Christian, their Christian tradition.
And how does that play out between the argument between Parmenion and Opatus?
Yeah. So, oh boy. So it backs up. So they're both assuming what their predecessors assumed, right? So the schism in Carthage with Donatus versus Cecilian. Cecilian was the first appointed bishop when the predecessor died, except it then comes to light that one, he was sort of rushed, so not all of the North African bishops were there, and two, he was ordained. They had the laying on of hands ceremony when he became bishop by someone who had handed over the scriptures to the Roman persecutors. So the reason that's so important is going back to Cyprian's time. Anyone who sort of in any way had denied Christ, right? There's persecution, and if you denied Christ, you had to do it some public way. So you were probably going down to the forum and offering a sacrifice to the Roman gods or the Roman emperor himself, or even signing a statement that you had, like any sort of pretense to deny Christ was seen as an act of idolatry, right? You've sacrificed to these Roman gods. And as Paul will say in his 1 Corinthian letter, you can't partake of idols and partake of Christ. So once you've got this sort of idol, they called it contagion, this sort of idol cooties, right? This idol disease, right? You've contracted. Well, you can't be in communion. Well, you can't come to the communion table and spread that to other people. So what the Donatist party and Parmenion, who inherits this, assumes is that anyone who has denied Christ through idolatry or been in communion with them is polluted. And instead, they reappointed their own bishop, someone who had not been polluted through that, the person who had been a betrayer, who had laid hands on Donatus. So the people who respond to that, the so-called Catholic party, say, well, no, we didn't they didn't think that could be sort of handed on from one person to another. So if you had contaminated idolatry, but you laid hands on me at an ordination ceremony, the sin is on you, not on me. So that's where sort of the heart of the debate really splits parties.
And that's a fundamental debate that really almost became irreconcilable between the two.
Yeah, that's right. And it's still around when Augustine comes along a few decades later. So when he becomes bishop in first priest and bishop in Hippo, he realizes this is sort of the debate of his day. This is the first decade of his ministry, is taking on this Donatist argument. And Augustine very cleverly kind of tries to take the Donatist argument to its logical, what he thinks is its logical conclusion. So the Latin phrase reductio ad absurdum. You reduce their argument to its absurdity. So he says, well, look, you Donatists claim you have the pure church, but you have people who have, told a lie. You have people who have committed a sexual sin. You've got all sorts of murderers and everyone else. There's no pure Christian and therefore no pure church. So you can't really be the pure church. And even if you do claim to be the pure church, we are the Catholic Church, right? We're the church in communion with the whole wider Christian world. So who are you to really think that you're the right party? But notice what Augustine has subtly done is he's shifted from the sin of idolatry, which is the particular sin that contaminates the communion, to any sin. And that's where the Dantes are probably where Augustine's misrepresenting the Dantes.
Maybe it gets a little bit away from the time period of the book, but going forward past Augustine and into when the Vandals take over North Africa, do you know much, and do scholars know much about what happens with the schism between the Catholics and the Donatists when the Arians take over the political situation, at least?
So we have a good bit of evidence about that time period, but then it comes down to how you're interpreting that evidence. So the sort of traditional view, here are the steps. In 411, there is this major conference, the Conference of Carthage, 411, and they allegedly, at this point, have reconciled the Catholic and Donatist party. Now, everyone knows, this is not in dispute, everyone knows that the outcome of this conference was predetermined. So the emperor sends his representative there. No matter what the Donatists say, they're going to be found guilty, and there's an edict issued that you have to reconcile with the Catholic party or else. And or else is at least you lose your property or major fines. These are already in place. One scholar called it the sort of baseball bats and bicycle chains kind of coercion. You're forced into the Catholic party at this point. So the assumption is that was effective. Augustine quits talking about the Donatists by and large after after 411. So you see you have a reconciliation of two parties, and then the Vandals come along into North Africa in 429, and then some sort of persecution erupts along the way. It's really much later in the 400s that there's major persecution. Scholars traditionally assume that the Catholics and Donatists is sort of reunited, and now they have a new common enemy, these Arians, the people who teach the same thing that Arius had taught at 325. Now, there's a good number of scholars who question this. I'm one of those who doesn't buy the story as being quite that simple. I think after 411, it's clear that the Donatists have not gone away. A, they're an underground church now. And B, by and large, if you live out in rural parts of North Africa where there's little imperial influence, and someone says you have to belong to the Catholic party, well, the Donatists have been shrugging their shoulders all along saying, we are the Catholic party. So when the Arians come on the scene, there is some evidence that I find compelling, but admittedly, this is not a majority view of scholars, that says the Donatists sort of welcome these Arians, because the Donatists were already excluded before they have the Council of Nicaea. So I keep saying the Arians. The Vandal tribe that comes in had the same teaching as Arius that was denounced at the Council of Nicaea 325. But remember, the Donatists weren't out that council. So even though Augustine says the Donatists are orthodox in their view of the Trinity, that's probably just convenient for him. He's trying to say Donatists need to come under our control. They're one of us. So I think there's still a lot of work to be done, to be honest with you, about how to sort out. How would we convincingly know which side the Donatists are on when the Vandals show up? How is it the Vandals so easily conquered North Africa and seem to sort of bring about a peace to everyone except the Catholic party? I suspect the Donatists and the Vandals were a lot closer than most scholars think.
And then the next phase, because I love that with North African Christianity, there's these really clear, you get a phase where then the new bosses come in, which is the Romans, but it's really the Eastern Romans that come in, and they're the power for quite a long time. Is there any evidence to say how this is all mixed back up again when they take over?
Well, yeah, that's right. So when the Vandals are finally defeated, it's the emperor coming from, we call it the Byzantine Empire now, but they call themselves Romans, but they're coming from Constantinople, and they're very Greek now. That's right. And so there's suddenly this new sort of imposition of at least cultural influence. I mean, they're welcomed, right? They're the Christians and the Orthodox party. So what you see is sort of what some scholars have tried to call a Donatist attitude in North Africa. Again, I think that's too simplistic, but it's still worth it considering, because you have sort of emperors meddling in church affairs, right? And there's something called the Three Chapters controversy, where these writers who are long dead are being denounced as heretics. And the Bishop of Rome finally even capitulates to this. And allows it. And the North African writers are adamant. They're not going to concede to this. And it's still what's comparable to the Donatists, at least, is sort of this sort of strident independence that the North African Christians had. They do not think the emperor has the right to tell the church what to do. And then, of course, it goes on. I mean, you have in the 600s these letters that suddenly pop up from Pope Gregory, who's concerned that the Donatists are back. And this baffles scholars because the Donatists haven't been named for over a century, except what's happening is these North African bishops are meeting independently. They're not following the Roman tradition of how you do a sort of appeal process. They're appointing their own bishops. They're passing around who's the primate of the area. So there's these unique North African features that to a Roman pope look like Donatism revived. Most scholars think that's a misunderstanding on Gregory's part. They're not actual Donatists. They're just continuing to do what North Africans have always done, which again goes back to how you define that early debate. I don't think they should be called They didn't call themselves Donatists. They just called themselves Christians. And so there is sort of this family line of inheritance that's still around. It's just not really a formal line of the Donatist party in schism from the Catholic party.
And then, I mean, we might as well see it through. Then the armies of Islam come through in the next century or so. And that seems to be where, when you read the common literature, that it's pretty much everything's blown up in North Africa. But even when you read some of the older things, you can see that they're not so sure that Christianity is just completely blown up. That it even to me, that as an armchair interest in this, that there's way more to the story than just Islam comes, it's all over, and now we have basically it's Islamic North Africa until 2021.
Correct. Right. No, that's right. So I think the reason that you sort of have this simplistic view of the story is the literary sources do fall silent around the year 700. So you had this just a prolific amount of writing throughout North African Christian history, from Tertullian, Cyprian, Augustine, and all those writers I mentioned from the Three Chapters controversy on. And then around 700, it's just silence. There are no more texts that survive. So it's very easy to sort of construct this story that says, well, see, when Islam came along, they were this oppressive, persecuting regime that finally succeeded in stamping out Christianity. But yeah, we know that there is still, even though the literary evidence falls silent, there's archaeological evidence, there's evidence from outside of North Africa, people who are visiting and going into North Africa, writing letters, talking about it. There are Muslim sources that are talking about what's happening in North Africa. That it's clear that Christianity continued for centuries on. Christianity was not really a persecuted religion. And I try to tackle this in the last chapter of my bigger book on ancient African Christianity, because when the sources fall silent, now there's even much more room for interpretation. So no one really has the surefire answers. But when you sort of go back and look at what the evidence does show, Islam was not a monolith. There was not sort of even today, right? There's different forms of Islam, Sunni, Shia, right? And then there's sort of all sorts of breakdowns in there, and also sorts of cultural differences when you span the globe from one Muslim country to another Muslim country. So that was even more pronounced, I think, early on, because sort of the concrete forms that we think of Islam having had not taken shape when the Arabs conquered North Africa. So to be a Muslim literally means to be one who submits. And if this Arab army shows up and says, do you submit? You know, these peasants working in the fields say, of course we do. And what do we have to do to submit? And you pay a higher tax. You have to admit there's only one God. You have to admit Muhammad is his messenger, but now you want to know, what did Muhammad say? And remember, the Quran, Muhammad tells, relates in the Quran a lot of things about Jesus that look like the biblical Jesus. So I think you just sort of have this slow overlap of Christianity and Islam, coupled with other factors like, we've already talked about these centuries of waves of new colonization coming in, and with each one came waves of people fleeing in exile. So over the centuries, you have more of a creep where Christianity disappears, not a overnight success.
At that time, by the time the Arabs come in the early 700s, Would there have been much of a Vandal identity left in North Africa? Do we know anything about that?
So again, ethnically speaking, probably not. By the time, what seemed to already be happening by the end of the Vandal period is the Vandals had so intermarried with the other peoples there in North Africa and across the empire. They were sort of creating political allegiances. So I think that's right. Once you have the Vandals really conquered politically, I doubt that there's much of any. I mean, there's already sort of a slip of the sort of the average Vandal Christian is probably speaking Latin by then, and then when the Byzantines come back, some speaking Greek in their liturgy, some probably even still speaking local indigenous languages like what's called Berber or Libyan or Punic. So we know these words and languages are around well into Augustine and after Augustine's time. So yeah, I think it's more like a melting pot than it is a single sort of one phase replaced by another phase.
And those Vandals and their Arianism probably would have just, by that point, 150, 200 years later, do you think it would have just folded into Latin Christianity at that point and Orthodoxy, if you will?
Well, again, you have to conjecture on that point. So we know that when the Byzantines came, they reestablished full Trinitarian Orthodoxy as we know it. However, how much did they try to enforce that at every sort of town and village? And there's a few scholars who tried to argue. I think it's probably a bit of an overreach, but there's this theory that says because Arianism was, dominant for 100 plus years in North Africa, Arianism has this lower view of Jesus. So Jesus is not fully God the way the Father is. He's somehow lower. Well, if the argument goes, if Islam comes on the scene and has this strident insistence on the one high God, and yet Jesus is a very important, Jesus is born of the Virgin Mary in the Quran. He's the prophet of God who ascended to heaven and will come back to judge the quick and the dead. The theory is this very nicely fits together. And so it explains why in North Africa, you could have the disappearance of Christianity eventually, whereas in Egypt and Ethiopia, you wouldn't, because they had this more strident, full divinity of Jesus view. Now, again, I think that's too simplistic, but it is tantalizing. It is sort of interesting to think that there may have been that played some factor.
Yeah, it ties things into such a nice, neat, easy bow and package that it makes you want to believe that, even though it's got to be way more complicated than that.
Right. Yeah, I think instead of trying to say one factor, right, there's probably a variety of factors that all played a part in different ways at different times.
Reading these things again as somebody who's looking at it through a layman's perspective, and you see that Spain, that there was Christianity held on much, much more than North Africa. And then you have to the east, you have Christianity that held on in Egypt longer. It makes you kind of think that what maybe were some of the factors. Was it just that there was much less Christian writing coming out of North Africa at that time, where it's easy to say, well, Christianity just got blown out in that area quicker just because we have a paucity of evidence for it?
Right. No, again, you're right. So that's the oddity is, why does Christianity survive in Egypt, Ethiopia, and Syria? Why does it survive in Spain, even when there's Islamic rule there, and not in North Africa, not in places like we would know today as Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, given the fact that those areas were so heavily Christianized before that? And again, this is one of the great mysteries in studying North African Christianity. So I don't claim that I've solved this at all, but I'll repeat that the idea of sort of thinking of several factors, I think, has got to be, you have this history of persecution, wave after wave of persecution. So not just the Romans persecuting the Christians, you have the Catholics persecuting the Donatists, you had the Vandals persecuting the Catholics, you had the Byzantines persecuting the Vandals. And so with those, you have also a wave of schism after schism after schism, right? You have these weakened churches. With that, you also have the sort of exile, waves of exile are leaving. So we know, for example, that when the Vandals came, that probably hundreds of Christians, if not more, are fleeing North Africa to get away from Vandal persecution. Probably more political alliances than really Christian alliances are at play, but still they see themselves as sort of Christian Orthodox party fleeing from the Vandal persecution. So when you do that century after century after century in North Africa, there is a sort of unique history there that I think sort of lent itself to Christianity being so weakened and ultimately removed from there. Now, remember, but it lasted. So there's a couple of the things that I think are interesting to consider. One, North African Christianity never had a literary culture that was indigenized the way it was in Egypt and Ethiopia and Syria. So you have the Coptic language in Ethiopia, in Egypt, Gez in Ethiopia. You have the Syriac language. North Africans, we know, spoke Punic and other languages. Augustine complains he can't get enough priests in his area who speak Punic, and the Donatists do speak Punic, and he's trying to convert the Donatists. So we know that they had this language, but we have no evidence at all that they translated their scriptures into Punic or into, again, or Libyan. So there is a theory that says maybe that contributed to why Christianity didn't really survive there. And then also just to point back to the fact that it did survive much longer than we thought. I mean, there's evidence that there may still have been a sort of Christian presence of some sort into the 1400s. And then you have a very, very small window before you have the Crusades, and the Crusades are already happening, and you have sort of a missionary presence like that are coming back in from Portugal and other places trying to sort of re-Christianize these places. But yeah, it was never Christianity largely did lose its footing in North Africa. And as I said, that's largely a mystery.
What was the nature of some of that evidence that you see after the Arabs take over, that Christianity survived in North Africa?
Yeah, so again, you have evidence from outside of Christianity. So we have letters from popes, we have lists of bishops, and they're still listing bishops in Carthage and Hippo and sort of the places where the Catholics had allegiances. And that makes us think that there must have been bishops in places where the Donatists had allegiances and where the Vandals had allegiances. You also have from the Muslim sources, you have complaints. These Christians are still around. Again, they're not being persecuted for a while because the incentive is to keep them Christians so you can tax them at a higher rate. But the complaints are, the Muslims are also celebrating Christmas and Easter. And so tell them to stop doing that. Christians do that. We don't do that. Which leads many scholars to think, well, maybe these weren't Muslims in a true religious sense. Maybe these were Christians who claim, again, if Muslim means to submit, and you submit to Islamic rule, but you continue celebrating Christmas and Easter, you sound like a Christian who just submitted for political reasons. So, it's those sorts of evidence of Christianity's presence that's still around. There's some inscriptions in Arabic that are clearly Latinized, so that they're writing in Arabic letters, but they're using Latin names and things like that, which makes you think, well, why are Arabs keeping these Latin names around? These are probably Christians having to use Arabic in their inscriptions.
And now a word from our sponsors. Yeah, so in a lot of ways in North Africa, because they lost that really direct connection to the rest of Christendom, it's just they're losing power, political power, economic power. And so it's just easier for them to kind of just fade away or become a marginalized people, you might say.
That's right. I mean, that's right. So how do you track an underground church? To my knowledge, social scientists to this day still don't know how to really do that well. So you have an underground church with, again, all these waves of pressures being put on it. So there's just a slow creep of Christianity being incentivized to move elsewhere or transform itself or something until it eventually loses its Christian character altogether. North Africa loses its Christian character altogether.
And I guess to go back, because into the book, there a lot of these initial issues between the Donatists and the Catholics is really laid bare. And one thing I'd like to ask about is one of the big things is that they're really talking about a physical space in the basilica, but also an allegorical space. And I'd love it if you just explain that a little bit more, because it really is they're playing with those ideas.
Yeah, so this is my theory in the book, is that the Parmenian sermon that we lost, but we have the responses to it. He keeps talking about how we now have restored the true church, and we are part of the true church. Well, my theory is he's talking about a physical space there, the basilica that is the cathedral church, meaning it's the one that the bishop has the Latin word cathedra, his throne in. Again, if you people, your audience are familiar with your podcast, they probably know this. So that's important to sort of have the real church to which all other churches have to be connected in the region. Now, when Julian the Apostate allows the Donatists to do this, they now have this bishop celebrating it. And he points to what he calls are the gifts of the church. The Latin word is the dotus of the church, the dotes, like an endowment that a bride is given. And it seems to me pretty clear. I think there's clear evidence that what he's doing is he's sort of just riffing off of all of the language that you find all the way back in the Song of Songs, where, remember, allegorically, that's Christ and Christ's bride that are in love. And so the bride, of course, has dowry. And that dowry was specific properties that would come along in marriage in Roman society. So the bishop says, look, we have this, in the cathedral, we have this chair, we have this altar, we have this chalice. And he starts pointing to specific objects in the church, and he can sort of correlate these allegorically with things that are said in the Song of Solomon. So then you have Parmenion, that's Parmenion's take. Then you have Optatus, who's on the Catholic side. The surviving text rebuts each of these, except instead of saying, nah, we have the physical space and we have the physical chair and we have the physical altar. And instead, he spiritualizes all of these things. And he says, no, the true chair, the true bishop's throne is not the one you're sitting in Carthage. It's the chair of Peter, to which all other churches must adhere to. And the sort of true altar is the altar of Christ that all of us, really it's the altar on our heart that we sacrifice thanksgiving to. And so he ironically, you have the Song of Songs that's allegorized to point to specific concrete items in Parmenion's Donatist church. But notice that's a material application. And then you have Optatus sort of re-spiritualizing them back to a generic church. So in the key text, I think, is early on when Optatus says that there were two bishops sent from Constantine to North Africa at the original schism to find where is the church, where is the true church. And after 40 days where there were mobs and riots in the streets of Carthage, they come back to Rome and say, oh, we found the church. The church is Catholic, meaning the church is everywhere. Well, I don't think that they were sent there to find that out. They already knew that sort of abstract theological principle. They were there to find where is the true basilica. And the Donatist mob would not let them reclaim it. They claimed it as their own. So that's what I think is going on in these texts is what do you mean by church? Do you mean the specific basilica, or do you mean the abstract the doctrinal church?
So what was the reason that Optatus would have turned it up to 11? Basically, he's allegorizing the allegory and then he's spiritualizing the physical. What's his motivation to do that?
Well, again, it's because Parmenion has the physical church. Now they have control over it. And so if you concede the point that whoever has the original basilica, well, then Parmenion and the Donatists have clearly won. So he's trying to rob them of their claim. Oh, yeah, you may have that basilica. And he doesn't even want to acknowledge that, although he acknowledges it because he says Julian Gate let you have it. So when he acknowledges, he says, yes, you have the basilica only because this pagan supported you. So clearly you're on the side of the devil. And if you want to talk about what the true church is, we are the true church in the abstract sense. So he's trying to win back the theological argument there.
Just to recapitulate date-wise, how close are they together? How soon after Parmenion wrote his sermon is Optatus doing his response?
Seems pretty close. I mean, so it's describing events from 363, and it looks like this text is written right about that time. However, there are also a few things that are interpolations. So there's mention of later bishops from around the 380s. So we know that the text that we have today has sort of been updated around 380. But there are other parts of the text that you can tell were not updated. He didn't have later information that would have helped his argument. So it looks like the text is pretty close to the time of Parmenion's sort of celebration.
And they're Optatus, he's making a logical legal argument that it doesn't matter who holds this basilica and we can be out on the street, but we're really the real Christians in town, no matter who's holding any particular building. Well,
that's right. So great point, because I've been saying it's a theological argument. That's the argument he's making to sort of win the hearts and minds of his audience. But he is also part of the movement. The so-called Catholic Party are petitioning the emperor and the governor in Africa to enforce the laws of the empire, right? And so remember Constantine, well, you and your audience know, Constantine allowed Christianity to be legal. It's not until 381 that Theodosius made Christians, like that's the only official religion of the empire, and to be a heretic or to be something else is a problem. So it's right in this time where Christians in Optatus's party and soon Augustine's party are petitioning to not only enforce certain laws against heretics, but to ramp up certain laws against heretics. And that's where, they are going to win the legal battle in addition to the theological battle they're trying to win.
Would these have been actually delivered as a verbal sermon, or were they meant to be written texts?
So Parmenian, I'm assuming, it seems to me clear that Parmenian's original text that Optatus is responding to was delivered orally in the church, in the Basilica of Carthage, because of some of the things he's concretely pointing to. But clearly he wrote that text down and probably had that sermon. I'm assuming it's a sermon, it's a speech in the church, and it's based off the Song of Songs, based on scripture. That looks like a sermon to me. That looks like a celebration sermon. He sends that text out far and wide. We don't have evidence as to who he sent it to or how he published it. Or these are always sort of in debate, but it looks to me like he probably sent that to everyone in his party, and word got out, right? And so other bishops in North Africa, like Optatus, are thinking, "Oh no, we can't let this guy claim that they're the true church. We have to write a response." And so Optatus's response is probably not a sermon at all. It's a treatise meant to be a rebuttal.
And so these are really, they're aimed towards the intellectuals and the elites and the politicians. Do you think, I mean, this is probably really going into speculation country now, but the average person just sitting in the pews or standing there, presumably, and they're looking at their metaphorical watch saying, like, what time is he going to stop this? I want to leave. Was this really not aimed towards them?
Well, I don't know. I suspect there's some of that aspect going on. This is an elitist conversation being had among intellectuals, the literate class. And yet we have other debates going on around the same time. So you have the Cappadocians writing, right? The Greek writers who are dealing with Arianism and dealing with other problems, sort of the fallout of Arianism. And they're making claims. They're saying that, they explicitly say in their text that if you went to the barbershop, and asked for a haircut, they would say, well, which view do you hold to, homoousios or homoiousios? And if you go to the baker and ask for bread, well, they're going to say, do you understand the Trinity in this way or in that way? So apparently these debates were hot button issues of the day. They were the politics of the day. And so I think there's an extent to which we have to assume that the everyday Christian and everyday citizen did know what was going on. And there was probably a lot of misunderstanding, just as there are in today's politics and, the water cooler conversations. But yeah, I think people were, if people were at least aware and engaged with these issues. And the question is, how literate were they about these issues? That's where I'm not certain.
Are there probably parts of this? Do you think that just the everyday Christian could have pulled out as sort of talking points if they're standing around the water cooler? Oh, Parmenian said this, but
yes and no. Yes, so we have evidence that sort of thing is happening. And then I think the question is, how vehement were the average people, right? So that's where, again, there's an intellectual, the bishops, the people connected to power and politics. They are vehement in their stance that it's us versus them. Again, Augustine's going to come along in a couple of decades and complain. He says, hey, you Catholics say you're Catholic, but you married a Donatist. You're not allowed to do that. And you say that you're Catholic, but you're doing business with all these Donatists, and you're for Donatists. They're elected officials who are Donatists that the Catholics are supporting. And so he's trying to, he realizes that on the ground, your average lay person is much more comfortable with the blurred lines between these parties. And he's trying to reestablish the line and reestablish his party as the dominant one.
Now, the dotes, or the gifts, in a lot of ways, they at least ring with the sacraments. Were they making any connections between these gifts and the sacraments of the church?
Okay, so again, it depends on how you interpret this text. And Optatus is constantly responding and saying, no, you don't have the right church, and you don't have the right dowries or dotes, the gifts. We do. And what's been done in the history of scholarship is they thought of these as marks of the church itself. So the church itself has sacraments, but the church itself is also first and foremost sacramental, right? It's a holy, sacred thing. And here are its marks. So in the Apostles' Creed, the church is one, holy, Catholic, and apostolic. Well, the history of scholarship thought that Parmenion and Optatus both had these sort of marks of the church in mind, the spiritualized theological marks, and they tried to debate who interpreted them the right way. Well, so I'm going against that majority view. I'm saying that the Parmenion originally was not talking about marks of the church. He was talking about concrete items in the church. And now that is where not only is the church sacramental in a spiritual way, he talks about the particular, the horn of drink that's mentioned in Song of Solomon, and how it's filled with wine. And he points to this. We know we're the true church because we have this, the font from which we drink, which I think is the chalice of the communion, the Eucharist. And yes, he's constantly talking about the what the Spirit does. And the Spirit, if you read really closely with what he's saying, is associated with baptism, because after you're baptized for what's seen to be the washing away of sins, you're then anointed by the Spirit. But that happens concretely with the anointing of oil. And he seems to be talking about how there's this argument about where is the Spirit trapped and how could you trap the Holy Spirit? It seems to be trapping, containing the oil of chrism that's in this vase sat on the altar. So yes, these are all very sacramental elements that are being debated. But again, I think it's the actual, tangible items holding these sacramental elements that's the real thing Parmenion was celebrating.
When you go to Augustine, he doesn't mention these dotus or the gifts at all in his writings. Now, is that just a lack of evidence? He just didn't think that it was worth bringing up, or was it something he wasn't aware of? And I wonder, as a corollary to that question, was this language of the gift something that was being talked about in different parts of Christendom or in Christianity in Rome and Cappadocia, and other places?
No, it was not at all. And that's where I think one of my strongest arguments is that I said the history of scholarship. This is modern scholarship, right? So modern scholars have read Optatus's way of interpreting these marks of the church, these dotus, these endowments of the church, as marks, but no one in the ancient world did. So even Augustine, and it's not a lack of evidence, Augustine's looking at the exact same text and other texts and sermons and debate scripts from Parmenion. He looks at Parmenion's text and doesn't see anything like the endowments being symbolic, spiritual, theological marks of the church. So why doesn't he mention them at all? I think it's because he's writing much later, right, in the 390s, 400s, and he doesn't have to worry about who has the right church anymore. That's long. That ship has sailed. His party has a basilica in Carthage and one in Hippo, and the Donatist party have a basilica in Carthage and one in Hippo. And if you go back to 363, when Parmenion has just reclaimed this basilica and used that to say, see, we're the true church, well, Optatus has to counter that immediately. He has to say, no, that we're the true church. Your basilica is not what we're talking about. We're talking about the theological basilica. And the same with the endowments. All those endowments or dotus you're talking about, we can rob them back from you in a theological sense. Well, a couple decades later, Augustine's past that. No one's arguing about the church building or the church, the vessels and the furniture in the church. He doesn't care about those items anymore. He's moved on to other issues.
Speaking of those physical items, there is an archaeological site of this actual basilica, the Basilica Restituta. There were some differences in the way that basilica was organized and laid out than other basilicas that makes it kind of interesting.
So that's right. Most scholars want to assume that was the cathedral basilica, meaning the one where the bishop sat in control. Because why else is it called Restituta, the restored church? It's the one that the Donatists had. The Catholics won it from them. The Donatists get it back from Julian, but then after 411, that later conference I mentioned, the Catholics get it back, and then the Vandals get it, and then the Catholics get it back again. So the fact that you wanted to restore this church probably means that's it. But there's actually, when we do archaeological evidence of the surviving sort of foundation stones of these churches. We can never be quite sure there's dozens of churches in ancient Carthage that you can go visit. The sites are just laid bare. You can go look at them. And to my understanding, the archaeologists aren't 100% certain which of those sites is the actual church that we look at. But I mean, when you look at all of those churches, North Africa has some unique features, such as we look in a church today and the altar is way up at the front under that half dome, the apse of the church. And just the priests go up there, right, and do their thing and then bring it back to the rail for the rest of us to take communion. That's not the way it was in North Africa in these churches. So the basilica, the center of it was called the navel, and it's mentioned in these texts. That's where you would put the altar. And all of the community would gather around that table. I mean, it's the center of what the church does.
So they would have been hanging out around the entire, in the round, so to speak, around that central altar.
Yeah, pretty much. Now, remember, there's all sorts of different offices and ranks in the church. So you would have one bishop in the church, and then you would have an array of a certain number of presbyters in the church. We'd call them priests today. And then you also would have the deacons helping out in some way. And then you would also probably have lined up sort of at the front on each side. You'd probably have the monks and the nuns. And then North Africa even has this other rank or office, and it's a very unique thing in early Christianity. They're also called elders. So if you know the word presbyter is from the Greek presbyteroi, which means elders. Well, the presbyter just becomes a borrowed word in Latin. The presbyterus or the presbytery are round. And there's this other Latin word, which means elders, seniores. And the seniores laici, we call them, the seniores as they're called in the text, these elders aren't clergy, and yet they somehow rule the church or have some sort of, so it looks like a body of lay persons, they're probably all men, laymen, who have like a governing, they're like some voting board. They have a special place in the church. And so yes, they're all in the round, but very much ordered as to who stands where.
And then just a way to wrap it up, because it's something I'm always fascinated in, and I'm trying to push my daughter's taking Latin, her Latin 1 class. And she's, why am I learning this? I'm never going to go to a coffee shop and order in Latin. Are you able to, when you read these texts with your scholarly training, you're just reading these in Latin and they're making sense, based on your training, but these are texts that are written in Latin that you're able to access?
Yes, that's right. So they're all available. Fortunately, now they're even available online if you have the right sort of university library password. But they are also almost all translated into English. And so, yes, it's much easier to do my work when you have you pull out whatever English translations have already been done to help you move quicker through the text. But there's a lot of baggage when you read later English translations. So, for example, the word font shows up in this text. Fontes, this means source or spring of water, literally. And, in the later Christian tradition, there's this high church way of doing baptism where it's a baptism of infants mostly, and it's just sort of taking the water from this very small pedestal and sprinkling it on people. But the archaeology of the ancient North African churches, those churches you mentioned, you can go see, they all have full immersion baptisms. And so when you read the word font or fontes in Latin, you can't impose these, even though English translations are always going to say, they come to the font. You can't assume that's the baptismal font, because there's no such thing in the ancient church. It's not a font. The font means the thing from which you drink. So that's right. You got to go with the original language to kind of double check the assumptions that are being made about it.
And looking at the original language, were Opatus and Parmenion, was there differences in style and usage in their Latin?
Well, remember, Parmenion's Latin is not in full available to us. So what we're constantly reading is Optatus's text where he says, Parmenion, you said this, and then he gives us the sentence. And we assume that's a pretty reliable description of his sentence because he's trying to rebut it. And he says, now you said this word, but you should have said that word or something like that. But remember, we're always beholden to Optatus. He may have paraphrased, he may have misremembered some things, transcribed things wrong. So unfortunately, we're not able to really look at the style of Parmenion the way we can with other texts.
Are there any examples of Donatist writings that have come through clean without any other interpretation?
Yes. There's yes, always with the caveat. So Optatus is the source who, at the end, I mentioned this appendix with several texts that survive that look like raw data. It's like court transcripts, it's trials that people have, it's letters. Now, even then, it's probably got some sort of tampering. There's another source that tells us the Donatists didn't agree to those. They didn't think those were reliable, and they had their own set of sources. And those, unfortunately, don't survive. But I think that's a pretty reliable set of texts. And then you add to it, we do have an anonymous Donatist sermon that has survived that you can look to. We have several Donatist martyrdom accounts that tell you what happened. And a few of those are still debatable as to whether they're as authentic as we thought. They tell about things from 312 that may have not actually been written down, maybe as late as a century later or almost a century later. But it's coming from the Donatist hand. So yes, for example, I mentioned how important Cyprian is. There's an Acts of Cyprian that is from Cyprian's time. And there's also another version that looks almost identical, except we're pretty sure it's a Donatist version because some of the Donatist slogans are in there. So instead of saying, glory be to God, gratia Dei, glory be to God, you say Laudatus Dei, praise be to God. And Augustine tells us that's the only Donatists say that. We say gratia Dei. So, you do get a chance to actually hear unedited Donatist voices, just not as much as we'd like.
And then just as a final wrap up, I've been interviewing a lot of scholars and I really try to go directly to the source, so to speak. And what is the thought within the academy today of making these connections with the scholarly material, that there's always interesting things coming out, to connecting that with the public, the interested public? And is that something that's becoming more of a thing, or was it always a thing to try and connect the academy with the public?
So yes, I think there's always been an emphasis sort of for those in the academy who are connected to the church in some way. Now, keep in mind, when you're looking at what's classically called patristic sources, the church fathers, the only real academics who are doing that tended to be Catholic or Eastern Orthodox, which means that you're looking at these as not just historical documents, but the voices of saints. Again, this is traditionally speaking. I'm speaking with broad brush strokes here, but you trust St. Augustine, and you want your popular people to know St. Augustine, and Augustine's Confessions are, available in very accessible translations, widely read by the lay people, especially in Catholic circles. Now, if you go and do the historian's task of saying Augustine is intentionally taking the Donatists to their logical conclusions so he can show their absurdity, well, now this sort of makes Augustine look bad. It makes Augustine look like he's misrepresenting people on purpose, if not lying. And so it's a lot harder to convince people who belong to traditional churches to be interested in that sort of revisionist history. But I think it's coming along. I think there's more and more sources of it. I think the interested layperson, or just interested, non-expert who wants to look back at his history, you can find the sources if you poke around.